One of the most controversial eras of American history is the time period of the Vietnam War. For my generation, that's my parents. I was born in '68, so we're still in the midst of the Vietnam War. So my dad was of draft age. He wasn't drafted, but he was of draft age. But for most of you, this is your grandparents' war. The Vietnam War to this day inspires impassioned debate, either for it or against it. And so a fundamental understanding of the conflict is bedrock to understanding the modern era. And it's my argument that I will continue through this, that the Vietnam War was the right war at the right place at the right time because it fit American doctrine. It fit what the United States was trying to accomplish. And what is that? Well, fit it in the much larger context that we've been talking about for the last few videos since the end of World War II, and that was containing communism. And what was the Vietnam War? Well, in the ultimate extension, it was trying to prevent South Vietnam from going communist. It was trying to stop the expansion of a North Vietnamese communist into South Vietnam, and as was prevalent with the containment theory in the Eisenhower years and the Kennedy years, prevent the domino theory, that first domino falling that would bring about the ultimate cataclysm of all of Asia and the entire world. And so to stop it, the United States was bound to get involved in the Vietnam conflict. Now the question, at least initially, is how much is too much? How much is necessary to stop communist expansion? And so we'll deal with that as we progress through. In this first video on the Vietnam War, we're going to talk about the origins of the conflict and about the initial involvement through the Kennedy years. And then in the second video, we'll talk about the Johnson and Nixon years of the Vietnam War and ultimately the end of the conflict. Just like with Korea and just like with Iran and other places, the involvement of the United States in Southeast Asia begins with the end of World War II. The Japanese had taken the opportunity of the French collapse in World War II to the Japanese allies, Germany, to move into the Vietnamese area, known as French Indochina, and I've got on the map what French Indochina. It had 5 basic components. In the north, the area of Tonkin. To the west of French Indochina was Laos. To the right of the peninsula was Annam. Then to the southern left was Cambodia, or Cambodge, as it was known at the today we know as Cambodia. And then at the very south end of the peninsula was Cochinchina. So all of that together, the modern map as it's redrawn, most of that is Vietnam on the eastern side and then Laos and Cambodia on the western side. And so as the Vichy French fall apart in World War II, Japan moves in to administer and then to control French Indochina, to extract the resources necessary for their war machine. But in 1945, as the war winds down by agreement between the Allies, the United States moves into South Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent China move into northern Vietnam, and there begins a modified joint occupation of the territory. The French, who were part of the victorious alliance, demanded that the area be restored to their control. And France wanted their authority maintained over all of French Indochina, even so far as supporting the Japanese puppet ruler, Emperor Bao Dai, continuing and appointing him as their representative over Indochina. But what rose up at the end of World War II was an opposition to Bao Dai's rule, and it was led primarily by Vietnamese nationalists, those who wanted to see Vietnam as an independent country from the colonial powers of France. And then borrowing from communist propaganda, the United States was seen as a colonial power. That's not really fair to the United States. The United States really didn't go in and occupy territory as a colonial power. The United States was simply trying to prevent the Soviet Union and China using the rhetoric of anti-colonialism to make North Vietnam and maybe the entire Vietnam Peninsula communist, i.e. a client state and thus a colonial power to the communist. One of the powerful nationalist forces that arises in the northern section of Vietnam was a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. And we'll come back to that. I just want to show you a picture of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist, and he led a group of Vietnamese nationalist insurgents known as the Viet Minh. And that's V-I-E-T-M-I-N-H, the Viet Minh. Their determination was to win independence for Vietnam and be free from all colonial powers. But let's make no mistake about it, Ho Chi Minh is not simply a nationalist. Now I'm borrowing this from a book written by Michael Lind, in which he makes the argument, and this is in historiography, there are those authors who advocate the United States should have never been involved in Vietnam, and this centers around Stanley Carno's huge tome on Vietnam. But Michael Lind represents a new generation of Vietnam historians who argue that Vietnam was exactly the right place to fight a war. We just should have fought it to win. And he says there's been a number of misconceptions that have grown out of opposition to the Vietnam War. An opposition, by the way, that was rooted in actually socialist propaganda, communist propaganda against Chiang Kai-shek in China. And it was brought into the United States through the American Communist Party and Soviet sympathizers, but the idea and the rhetoric was brought into the United States and used in the American anti-war movement. But they also borrow from the isolationists before World War II, even going back so far as the anti-imperialist of the beginning of the semester. They borrow the rhetoric and the ideas from those thinkers. But here's some of the things that Michael Lind says in Vietnam, the Necessary War, that he says have grown up as myths. First, Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist, but he was a Vietnamese nationalist whose Marxism wasn't just a veneer. There are many who argue that Ho Chi Minh could have easily been swayed to capitalism. He could have been swayed to supporting the United States if the Truman administration had just given him support when he asked. But Michael Lind says there's simply no proof of that. Ho Chi Minh was indoctrinated and fully immersed into the communism of Mao Zedong and of Joseph Stalin. He was a communist through and through. Another myth that Michael Lind exposes was that Ho Chi Minh was not the only legitimate nationalist leader in Vietnam. He and his subordinates found it necessary to execute, assassinate, imprison, and exile non-communist leaders and dissidents in both North and South Vietnam. In fact, Ho Chi Minh is going to launch one of the most deadly purges that the world has ever seen. just like Joe Stalin, just like Mao Zedong, his political opposition is eliminated. There are those who argue that Ho Chi Minh was a Southeast Asian Marshal Tito who could be weaned away from Moscow and Beijing, and that the United States missed a number of opportunities. And Lin says that's simply not true. There's no evidence of it. And then we'll talk about other myths as we progress through the Vietnam War. And so Ho Chi Minh, as a Vietnamese nationalist, is going to resist French colonialism and U.S. support of France in Vietnam. Now, France was willing to compromise with Vietnam, but Vietnam, where are the borders of Vietnam? And as Vietnam carries over the conflict, as Ho Chi Minh and his most successful general, General Vo Nguyen Giap, are highly successful in prosecuting a war against French re-entry into Vietnam, it looks as if Vietnam may expand into Laos and Cambodia. And so to prevent Vietnamese incursions into Laos, the French fight a series of battles, the First Indochina War, fight a series of battles to stop Vietnamese aggression into Laos and into Cambodia. Ultimately, what will be the Achilles heel of the United States, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Well, its genesis is in North Vietnam, and it's a mountain route in which supplies and propaganda and anti-Western support travel down. And so General Vo Nguyen Giap, in leading the opposition to the French, is going to be highly successful until the French adopt a military tactic called the hedgehog. And they first used the hedgehog at the Battle of Nay Son. And I've got an arrow there pointing to roughly where Nay Son is located. And the French borrow this idea, and in fact the United States will use it later along the lines of the fortified hamlet approach. They chose a highly defensive position. They pumped up their reserves in that area and then let the Vietnamese assault them. And at the Battle of Nay Son, the French are highly successful in decimating the Vietnamese forces. So as this civil war rages between the French trying to reestablish their empire and protect their client states of Laos and Cambodia, Vietnamese nationalists are trying to gain as much territory as possible. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh approached the Truman administration and asked the Truman administration for monetary support and military support. The Truman administration investigated and distrusted Ho Chi Minh's resume. They didn't trust him as being a capitalist. In fact, he had studied at the University of Moscow. He walked like a communist, talked like a communist, and seemed to be a communist. And so Truman said no. And so Truman begins the process of not necessarily opposing, but certainly not supporting Ho Chi Minh's nationalism. As the French reestablished themselves, by 1954, Ho Chi Minh was receiving substantial aid from Communist China and the Soviet Union. So while the United States was paying 70% of France's cost in fighting the war in Indochina, Ho Chi Minh is receiving almost 100% of his support from the two communist allies. And so by 1950, the fear of Ho Chi Minh's communist connections that Truman had suspected were confirmed. In 1954, however, France's attempt to use the hedgehog and maintain their presence in northern French Indochina ran into an obstacle. That obstacle was the application of the hedgehog defense at a place called Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu is a valley fortress. Advisors to the French, American military advisors to the French said, you know, that's not really a good place to defend, especially using the fortified hedgehog approach. You know, you probably don't want to be in a valley surrounded by mountains in which the enemy can take the heights and rain artillery fire down on you. The French commander, Brigadier General Christian de Castries, his reply was, hey, we know what we're doing. You know, the implication is we're the descendants of Napoleon. We've fought great wars before. We don't need your advice. Besides, the Vietnamese don't have artillery. And if they did have artillery, they don't have trucks to get it up on top of that mountain. And if they did have trucks to get it up on top of that mountain, they don't have roads. And so it's no big deal. The valley constricts their movement. And for them to attack us, they're going to be confined in their ability to maneuver. And they're going to charge right into our guns. And we're going to mow them down. And the French win. Well, there's a problem. The French were right that the Vietnamese didn't have artillery. But the Russians and the Chinese do, and they give them to the Vietnamese. And Giap didn't have trucks. They were right. He didn't have trucks to get the artillery up on those mountains. And they were right. There are no roads to get the artillery up on top of the mountains. But what Giap and Ho Chi Minh do have are peasants. And they can read a schematic, and they disassembled the artillery, and they humped it up that mountain piece by piece. And those wascally peasants got on top of the mountains, reassembled the artillery pieces, and then a long supply train of peasants, each one carrying an artillery shell, built an ammunition reserve on the mountain. And from March through May of 1954, the French became trapped. 12,000 French soldiers became trapped at Dien Bien Phu with artillery shells raining down on them from the heights, and they held on to what amounted to an impossible position. It was clear that French military collapse was inevitable. And so the French made a request, 1954, Dwight Eisenhower's president. The French approached Eisenhower and said, Ike, we would like to borrow 3 small atomic bombs. And we'll use those atomic bombs to blast the Vietnamese troops on the heights, and there'll be no more Viet Minh insurgency. Dien Bien Phu will be a French victory. And Ike basically replied, and please understand I'm putting words in his mouth, but in context he said, are you crazy? No, I'm not going to give you 3 atomic bombs to bomb Dien Bien Phu. So then the French said, well, you know, could we borrow your Air Force and just drop bombs until they're all dead? Eisenhower said no. Now, Ike believed that Vietnam should be preserved. He believed that the French presence was necessary, but he wasn't desirous of American troops getting involved in a ground war or American air power getting involved in a shooting war in Vietnam. So he spoke out and said no. And while publicly he's speaking the rhetoric of freeing Vietnam and applying the row of dominoes theory of Dean Acheson, Ike went against his cabinet, he went against his vice president, Richard Nixon, and he went against his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. and refused to permit American involvement in Vietnam, claiming that neither Congress nor American allies would support such a decision. And so on May 7th, 1954, the French fortress of Dien Bien Phu surrendered to the Vietnamese, to Vo Nguyen Giap. France, wanting to limit the hemorrhaging of cash, to stop their involvement in Asia, to solidify what they did control, asked for a meeting on the issues in Vietnam. The summit would take place in Geneva, Switzerland, with Vietnam being high on the list, but also Korea. When the Korean armistice had been signed, it had declared that within 6 months of the armistice there would be a meeting to discuss peace. Well, events of the Cold War intervened, and there had been no meeting. So Korea is high on the list at Geneva, and French involvement in Vietnam. You can see the top invited guests. The first being Vyacheslav Molotov. We've been talking about Molotov since before World War II. This is kind of his swan song. When he returns from the Geneva summit, he's going to go into retirement. Also present was the communist Chinese foreign minister, Zhou Enlai. He will eventually, much later in the 70s, become premier of China. And then the representative, the diplomat representing North Vietnam, Pham Van Dong. And then representing the United States, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, the British Foreign Minister, Anthony Eden, and then the French Foreign Minister, Charles Bideau. And then there were representatives of the southern area of Vietnam, which, by the way, had been a separate peoples and a separate identity from North Vietnam since the 1600s. So the divisions that ultimately are going to be placed on Vietnam aren't an artificial division. They're based upon some historical precedent. But at the Geneva summit, the French negotiate a withdrawal from North Vietnam and the turning over of North Vietnam to the government of Ho Chi Minh. That government would be based in Hanoi, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, as it called itself, which was basically the Viet Minh translated into a ruling government. A movement becomes a government. Dividing North Vietnam from the South Vietnam would be the 17th parallel, or the demilitarized zone, and there wasn't supposed to be any armed troops within 3 miles of each side of the DMZ. So a 6-mile wide zone, 3 miles on each side, in which no troops were to occupy. But as you can see on the red line on the board, the Ho Chi Minh Trail bypasses the DMZ using Laos and Cambodia to bring supplies, to bring the Viet Minh into South Vietnam and to destabilize it. South Vietnam is organized into the state of Vietnam, and it would be under the leadership of Bao Dai. And so in the north, you have Ho Chi Minh, and in the south, you've already seen the picture of Bao Dai, and he asks an exiled South Vietnamese resident, Ngo Dinh Diem, to come out of exile in France and to be his prime minister. And so in 1954, as the partition of Vietnam goes into effect, based upon the Geneva Accords, July 1954, Vietnam is divided between North and South Vietnam, with the North being communist, the South being westward leaning, call it capitalist if you so desire, and separate governments are established. Now the Geneva Accords go on to say that the independent states would exist from 1954 to 1956. Remember, these are based on geographical, political, and social divisions that already existed. That's why they divided them, because the South isn't going to accept Ho Chi Minh, neither is the North going to accept Bao Dai. So this division already existed, and it's put in place by the Geneva Accords. But both groups, Ho Chi Minh and Bao Dai, don't like the division. Ho Chi Minh, under pressure from the Soviets and the Chinese, is going to accept the separation. The state of Vietnam, under Bao Dai, refuses to sign the Geneva Accords and refuses to recognize the separation, and so too the United States. So while Britain, France, the Soviets, the Chinese, and the North Vietnamese all signed the Geneva Accords, South Vietnam and the United States say not only no, but hell no, we're not going to play. The requirement was that in 1956 there would be general elections in both North and South, and that whichever side won, the two halves of Vietnam would be reunited under that leader. Well, neither Bao Dai, nor anybody in his administration, nor anybody in the Eisenhower administration, and really no one in England and France believed that these would be free, unfettered elections without cheating. They firmly believed that the communists would cheat in the election, and it would be skewed, and that they were going to lose. And so, State of Vietnam and the United States refused to participate in the Geneva Accords. And so the state of Vietnam would exist until 1955. In 1955, Emperor Bao Dai was deposed, and Ngo Dinh Diem became president of the Republic of Vietnam. And you can see on the board the flag of South Vietnam and the presidential standard of the president of South Vietnam. And Ngo Dinh Diem is going to stay in office from October 26, 1956 through November 2nd. So once he's in office, he's going to be the guy for 7 years that the United States deals with. Ngo Dinh Diem was Catholic. He was pro-Western. And the problem with Ngo Dinh Diem is his brother. His brother is his chief advisor, and his brother is also very corrupt. But we tend to hold Ngo Dinh Diem to Western standards, when by Oriental standards, he does a fairly effective job of governing South Vietnam. But with the ascendancy of Ngo Dinh Diem, the state of Vietnam becomes the Republic of Vietnam, and Diem becomes someone the United States has to work with. Conversely, the North begins actively trying to undermine the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem. As I said, Ho Chi Minh had never been pleased with the Geneva Accords, nor is there any indication that he intended to abide by them. In fact, he was deeply dissatisfied with the separation of the South, because the South was where the money interest was. It was where the real support was. And then as the French pulled out of North Vietnam in agreement with the Geneva Accords, part of that agreement was not only that the French troops could leave North Vietnam, but that citizens who sided with the South could also leave. And there's a massive migration of people who don't want to live under communism that move south into South Vietnam or board French ships that are then transferred to U.S. ships who then bring them to South Vietnam. There's a massive shift of population that takes place. But Ho Chi Minh begins using the Viet Minh to infiltrate South Vietnam through the National Liberation Front. The National Liberation Front is the political wing trying to undermine the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem. And then coupled with the National Liberation Front are the guerrilla fighters fighting in South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong, standing for the Vietnamese Congress of Communist Nations. So the Vietnamese Congress and the Viet Cong, led by General Nguyen Van Thai, and they began actively, and you can see the attack on a hotel in South Vietnam, in Saigon, where terrorist tactics are used, car bombs, suitcase bombs, assassinations, any underhanded trickery, and thus in retaliation, Ngo Dinh Diem is forced to use all means necessary to suppress opposition to his regime. Now, Ngo Dinh Diem is not brought up in a system where there's freedom of the press and freedom of speech and all the things we hold near and dear. He's progressing toward that, but he's also trying to fight a war of liberation and a war of stabilization in his own country against what he knows is outside influence. And to do that, he's in essence having to fight a guerrilla war within his own country. And so he turns to the United States for help. And President Dwight Eisenhower will make that initial help available. In fact, the slogan was, "Sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem." You know, he's our guy. He's the best we've got. And so the United States began supporting Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a Catholic. Unfortunately, Catholicism only made up about 10% of the South Vietnamese population. The other 90% were predominantly Buddhist. And the Buddhist community was infiltrated by the NLF and the Viet Cong and presented very vocal opposition not only to Diem's Catholicism, to Diem's aristocracy. He's descended from a very aristocratic family and from a family that had been influential rulers and supporters of the leaders of French Indochina for a century. So he's part of the establishment. And since the Buddhist community is supporting the communist infiltrators, the NLF and the Viet Cong, Diem uses the opportunity to begin prosecution of the Buddhists, land reforms, taking land away from Buddhist temples and Buddhist monks and redistributing it to the population, while at the same time not instituting land reforms that would take land from the aristocrats in South Vietnam and give it to the peasants. There are a lot of issues in South Vietnam that Diem has to overcome. And Diem, in our view, isn't a nice guy. But he's taking steps that he sees necessary to survive and to fight the insurgency against him. And so by the time Eisenhower leaves office in 1959, well, he leaves office in 1961, but in 1959, the United States began providing military support and advisors to Diem. In 1959, there were 760 military personnel in Vietnam in an advisor capacity, mostly in the deep south and nowhere near engaging in combat. They were training personnel. In fact, it's so small, so much of a small commitment that no one really paid it much attention. By the time Eisenhower left office in 1960, and we'll use the figures for the end of 1960, there were 900 military personnel in Vietnam. That's still, in the great scheme of that, that's not very many. In fact, that's a smaller military commitment than we have in most other nations. So Eisenhower's keeping the lid on the affairs in Vietnam. But when Kennedy becomes president in 1961, John F. Kennedy, remember, he comes into office with a very stringent anti-communist rhetoric. And his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, along with his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson. In fact, Lyndon Johnson is going to travel to South Vietnam. And upon his return from South Vietnam, he's going to compare the condition of the Diem administration and the Diem supporters to the Texans at the Alamo. And he said, you know, just like the United States set out the Texas Revolution and didn't come to the aid of the Alamo, so too we're going to be guilty of leaving Diem in his Alamo, and they're going to be destroyed, and Vietnam's going to fall, and it's going to be the first of those dominoes to fall, and then all of Asia's going to go to communism, and then all of the world. Never explaining how all that actually fit together, but Lyndon Johnson came back a firm supporter of the war in Vietnam, and McNamara, Lyndon Johnson, and then Kennedy's own desire to oppose communism leads Kennedy to strengthen his support for Diem. And so by 1963, an ever-increasing American presence in Vietnam, Kennedy went on national TV and explained what was going on in North Vietnam, the necessity of providing men and supplies to North Vietnam. And by 1963, there were 16,300. So I'm roundabout approaching another question for you. And the question is, who's responsible for the war in Vietnam? Kennedy certainly is responsible. Eisenhower, to a limited extent, Truman has been blamed for not helping Ho Chi Minh and supposedly turning him away from communism. You have Eisenhower who puts in the first troops, but even at the end of Kennedy's administration, there's only 16,000 American personnel, and they're involved in training and providing supplies. They're not engaged in active combat against an ever-increasing opposition. And by 1958, there's a full-fledged civil war going on in South Vietnam. The simple fact is Kennedy took office, he did not like Ngo Dinh Diem. He opposed Diem on many levels, and it's ironic because Diem is Catholic and so too was Kennedy. But Kennedy nonetheless didn't like Diem, and he didn't like the photo opportunities that Diem's opposition managed to secure and make Kennedy's support of Diem look bad. And in fact, a number of high-profile Buddhist monks, to show their dislike of Diem's reforms and to protest, unlike terrorists of today, or even like terrorists of their day, the NLF or the Viet Cong, who would go in and blow up a hotel and try to kill as many of the opposition as possible, the Buddhists would kill themselves. And they would do it in a very high-profile manner. And so you see here the immolation. And he did it to himself. You see his car behind him. In fact, it's a shrine in Vietnam today, that car. He doused himself with gas. You can see the can of gas right there. And he set himself on fire in the middle of a busy Vietnamese intersection. And here it is, caught on camera, caught on the nightly news. It's shown to Americans that the Buddhists are willing to go to this level of protest against Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem must be a bad guy. And it became Kennedy's obsession that Ngo Dinh Diem had to be removed as president of the Vietnamese Republic. And so Kennedy, through the CIA, give tacit approval to the opposition against Diem to have him murdered. Now, the CIA didn't kill Ngo Dinh Diem. South Vietnamese generals, or ARVN generals, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN generals, specifically General Duong Van Minh, and you see him in the bottom there, is responsible for the assassination of Diem. While promising Diem and his brother an opportunity to go into exile and live in exile forever if they wanted on a nice pension, Diem and his brother take the opportunity. They were in an armored personnel carrier, and believe me, there are some very graphic pictures that I chose not to show you of the bodies of Diem and his brother who were assassinated in the back of an armored personnel carrier, sprayed with bullets and killed. And so November the 2nd, 1963, Ngo Dinh Diem is assassinated. And if this is a picture of his tombstone and grave in Vietnam, and by the way, his if you can zoom in or Google that picture, you'll see that it does not say Ngo Dinh Diem. They in fact used his Catholic name, John Baptiste something or other, as on his grave. So you'd have to know it was his Catholic baptized name, and that was him. He's in relative obscurity, even in death. But he's replaced as president by General Minh. And ironically, or maybe it's not ironically, there is one conspiracy theory that within the same month, notice it was November 2nd, 1963, when Diem was assassinated. On November 22nd, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And Lyndon Johnson, who is a firm supporter in the defense of Vietnam, is now president. Almost at once, Lyndon Johnson looks for an excuse to increase American involvement with South Vietnam, to stop the spread of communism. And so Lyndon Johnson, looking for that excuse, will be provided, or another interpretation is created, an opportunity at a place called the Gulf of Tonkin. And we'll pick up there next time.